This segment will be on thermonuclear war and how to survive it. Now, first of all, let me state that if there ever was a nuclear war between major powers, it would be the worst catastrophe that's ever happened to humankind. However, I believe that modern research shows that the human race would survive it, including billions in the countries that are combatants. I can think of no reason why any thermonuclear weapon would be targeted to South America, Africa, Greenland, Iceland. There'd be major segments of the world that would not be involved. Also, it's quite shocking, or at least it was shocking to me, that there has been 2 nuclear weapons used in actual wars at Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. But there have been 2,121 nuclear weapon explosions in tests. And this is under the water, underground, surface, the atmosphere. It's amazing that they had to do all that testing. Now, what do I define as a full thermonuclear war? I submit it would be 2 major powers or more and their allies exchanging their nuclear-ready arsenals. And those arsenals for Russia and the U.S., it's interesting how, I suppose that no one in the lay community knows how many weapons are involved. I suppose there's people, I'm sure there's people in military planning that know exactly. But the estimates have been from 300 under President Obama to as many as 18 or 1900 are ready to go at any one time with the United States. Now, I have been out of the military for almost 40 years. I don't have any inside information. I have only what I've read. I've read extensively and researched this extensively. And 2 books that I would highly recommend to you is this book here called The Nuclear War Survival Skills, Life-Saving Nuclear Facts, and Self-Help Instructions. Now, this book is extremely easy to find. You can go to the internet and download it for free as a PDF file. Also, you can go to Amazon and download it as an ebook, or as you see here, you can purchase a copy as a hard copy and have it sent to you. This was written in about 1985. The information on shelters and nuclear blast are as timely as ever. There are some portions in the book that are dated. I'll talk about those later, but I'd highly recommend this book, and you can get it for free as a PDF file. The other book is this one here called Survive the Coming Nuclear War, How to Do It, by Ronald L. Pruitt, and I understand his father, Robert L. Pruitt, medical doctor. Now, this book you can find at Amazon, and there's an interesting price influx here. For the paperback copies, they, the current owners have a very high value that they placed on them. Interesting enough, the hardback copy of this is still reasonable. And this is an excellent book. Ronald is a journalist, and the flow of the writing is excellent. He's just an excellent writer, and it's an easy read with very thoughtful insights. And his father, the medical doctor, I assume, was the one that brought in a great deal of detail, particularly on like first aid training and so on. So excellent book, highly recommend it. Now, I have 2 other kind of unique insights into this of nuclear war. One is my father was career military, 27 years. And the last 10 years of that in the Air Force, he was in the Minuteman ICBM program, Intercontinental Ballistic Missile. So he was always very tight-lipped, loose-lipped, sink ships. But when you live on Strategic Air Command bases as a teenager and as a young man for 10 years, you get a feel for it. And there was lots of literature at the library you could read. And the second sort of insight was while I was a United States naval officer for 4 years, I never had anything to do with nuclear weapons. But during my training to be an officer, I spent a summer in 1974 at Itajima, the Japanese Naval Academy. And as part of our trip there, they took us to Ground Zero, Nagasaki, and Hiroshima. So this would have been 1974, so almost 30 years after the A-bombs were dropped on those two cities. And at Ground Zero, they had some actually surprisingly modest war memorials. And across the street, there were shopping centers or shopping stores and restaurants and so on. In other words, those cities had fully recovered. Without the war memorial, and knowing the fact that the history of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, you wouldn't even know there had been an explosion there. Another quick story was while I was training to be a naval officer, I had the interesting opportunity to spend some time at Camp Pendleton, the Marine Corps camp in California. And at the culmination of our time there, we were able to go see a fire display and firepower display. And what this consisted of is they would have a Marine in perfect starched uniform run out with a 45 pistol, and he would shoot it. And then another Marine would run out in perfectly starched fatigues, and he would shoot an M16. And then the next one was an M60 machine gun, and on we went. And then the culmination of that, a fighter jet bomber came in and it dropped a canister. And you saw the canister coming down, and then bam, a napalm explosion. And naturally, we were at a very safe distance from this, but let me tell you, I would estimate an area larger than a football field suddenly became hell, just bellowing flames. And I sit there and I thought, you don't ever want to be under something like that. So, how do you survive a thermonuclear war? Well, there's 4 essential steps, I think. And there's other things involved, but 4 key ones. One is, don't be under where the bomb drops. Now, how could you do that? Well, it requires some pre-planning and pre-action. You can actually go on the internet and just type possible U.S. nuclear targets, and you will find some very interesting maps. Not only nationwide maps, but also ones by individual states. And to my knowledge, this is just general public information, but clearly someone put a great deal of thought into it. I've looked at some of the states that I'm very familiar with, and in several cases I wondered, why would they ever drop a bomb at that location? And then when I got to researching that area, that city, that town, I realized, there is something of importance there. So, go to the internet, look up the states of your interest, and study those maps. Now, how would this unroll? Well, I don't think anybody knows, but in, once again, the public literature, a typical scenario in a full thermonuclear strike would be that submarine launched continental missiles would be launched. This would give would be hitting their targets in 5 to 15 minutes. And what would they hit in the first wave? Well, command and control centers for the federal government, for the military. They would also be hitting our nuclear resources, for subs, for bombers, for intercontinental ballistic missiles. This would be the first wave. They also might hit key communication centers, key industries that would be directly contributing to any future war effort. And then there's a whole nother level where they would start bombing population centers, so the larger cities. Now, in the book Surviving the Coming Nuclear War, the authors present, because I don't think those maps were present at that time, they stated command and control centers, our nuclear weapons offensive facilities, and any city larger than 45,000. Now, that doesn't guarantee that those targets would be hit, but it's a high probability that they would be. And what you need to do is not be under one of those. So what would that entail? Well, we need to know a little bit about the explosion of a nuclear weapon, which information is readily available in just the two books that I just talked about, and also the internet. It's not super simple. You can't give one answer fits all for several reasons. One is, as a general statement, there's two types of proximity explosions. One is you have an aerial burst, and that was the case at Nagasaki and Hiroshima. By having an aerial burst, the thermal effects, the heat of the bomb explosion, and the overpressure, the blast, goes down over a wider area, and you get a wider area of damage. Now, with like a missile silo that's buried in the ground, or a command and control center that's buried in the ground, it would seem, from a nuclear explosive expert, you'd want to have a ground burst, and this would shock the ground more, and hopefully, from the enemy's perspective, disrupt the missile silos, or the command and control centers, would destroy them. So there's those two variables. Is it an aerial burst? Is it a ground burst? And by the way, the aerial burst puts off less radioactive material, and a ground burst is the worst for the notion of there will be an after danger from radiation, because the material on the ground that's disintegrated goes up with the cloud and is radioactive. Another key item is, what is the size of the bomb? Now, at one point back in the Cold War, the U.S. tended, I understand as you read, who knows for sure, except for people that have clearance for this sort of thing, is the U.S. kind of favored 1 megaton bombs. Now, 1 megaton means 1 million pounds of dynamite. So it's a large explosion. Originally, the Russians at the height of the Cold War were using 10 and 20 megaton bombs. Now, it's now commonly thought that both sides are using 1 megatons, give or take a couple 100,000 pounds of TNT, so a smaller area. Now, as a general, so one size doesn't fit all, because you don't know how large the bomb is going to be. But the size of the bomb is not linear. A 50 megaton bomb, which the Russians produced and tested, called the Tsar bomb, is not 50 times more effective than a 1 megaton. It just doesn't work that way. Matter of fact, as a kind of a loose rule of thumb, and what I read, it's about 5 times more powerful. So with the type of weapons that the general literature seems to perceive that would be used, it's about 1 megaton. This means that within about 2 miles of ground zero, well, you don't have to worry about anything because you're going to be gone. Now, there would be tremendous casualties from 2 miles to 5 miles. And then from 5 miles out to as far as 20 miles, or maybe even further, there would be a lot of damage and so on from the thermal effect and from the blast effect. Then, at the immediate area, within 20 minutes, the fallout would start coming down. And here, a lot depends on, once again, is it an aero burst, is it a surface burst, and what are the winds and how do they disperse it. As a general rule of thumb, the toxic cone was very, very thick radioactive material, could be out as far as 25 or 30 miles. And then there's a contaminated plume that could be out as far as like 35 miles. And there have been tests that they've done where there was some surprising results. There was a significant radioactivity as far as 100 miles away, but yet just a few miles from there, there would be none. Now, at low level, the radiation would be spread potentially worldwide. You could have an explosion on one continent that, as we saw in the Japanese meltdown of their power plant, might drift to another continent. But it's felt that radioactivity, it certainly would raise the statistics on all sorts of cancers and so on, but you wouldn't see deaths directly from that. So, the first major thing you need to do is not be under the bomb. So, I would invite you to look at these maps, to think about your local area, and at minimum be 20 miles away. Now, if you want to have even less chance with the radiation, be 35 miles away. Now, when I picked my homestead, I looked at these maps and ensured that I would be 100 miles away from any likely nuclear accident at a power plant or a target in case of a nuclear war. Now, so number one is don't be there. So this requires you to relocate before the war ever happens. Matter of fact, I read an interesting article that was printed in the 1950s that predicted what we had to do was just totally disperse all over cities and move out into the country. Well, as we know, our society didn't elect to do that, but you can if you choose to. The second way to address that, perhaps not in a very elegant way, is to be prepared to bug out and have a specific location, hopefully 50, 100 or more miles away, where you can have a bug out location. It is possible that we might have a Pearl Harbor type attack where just out of the blue the war is triggered. But in this day and age of satellites and signal intelligence, where we monitor the various worldwide, the intelligence agencies monitor telephones and text messages and phone calls and everything else, and they can easily see any movement of military equipment. It's highly unlikely that would happen, or potentially you would have hours, days, weeks to know it was building up to a potential crisis, and you need to bug out way early for that. When you look at Hollywood, sometimes they just do things because it's entertaining. You know, the Mad Max series and The Road. I love those movies. They were so entertaining. But I personally can't envision a scenario where they ever come to that. Now, a very realistic movie of a thermonuclear war is a movie called Threads, which I believe is available on Netflix now, and definitely is available on Amazon, and it's about England in a World War III. And they show the scenario of a military target being hit and then a civilian target very close to the military target being damaged. And it is just incredibly realistic, I think. And one interesting thing about that movie, they take it 20 years into the future. Um, Another couple good Hollywood shows to see what might happen in the case of you did get out from under the bomb is there was a movie made in the U.S. about 1985 called The Day After that I think it's got some Hollywood stuff in it, but it's pretty realistic and depicting if you were 50, 100 miles away. And then there was the TV show Jericho, which had lots of subplots and so on to keep it interesting, Hollywood type thing, but roughly could be depictive of a small town that survived the initial effects of the war. So I'd invite you to look at those. But number one, don't be under where the napalm or the nuke weapon lands. Number two is to remember that when a thermonuclear weapon goes off, it creates a light brighter than, once again, depending on the size of the bomb, anywhere from 10, 30 or more times brighter than the sun. And if you look directly at that, that can temporarily blind you. And in a few cases in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, there were a few people permanently blinded. Well, that'd be the last thing you need to have happen in World War III. So if you ever see a really bright light, and it might be tempting to reflectively look at it, try not to, but if you do, the best thing is turn away from it, close your eyes, cover your face, and then get down flat on the ground so that if you're within 30 seconds to a minute or a little bit longer with larger weapons, the light will dissipate and you'll be able to open your eyes. The reason why you want to get up flat on the ground is to hopefully, if you're terribly close, to have some of the thermal effect and blast effect go over you. So that's the second major thing. So a lot of people, they make fun of the old, 1950 movie drills where you dropped under your desk and closed your eyes. Well, it actually made sense. And this also gives you protection from windows being blasted out and shattering glass all over. The third major obstacle that you need to overcome is that of radioactivity. Now the good news is radioactivity will severely decrease in the first 48 hours and then continue to deteriorate significantly over the next 12 days. So in the first 14 days, there's marked decrease in radioactivity. So you need to be in an area that has no or a safe level of radioactivity, or you need to have a radioactivity shelter. Now, varying once again on the size of the bomb, the toxic plume, depending on how the wind is blowing, can be 20, 25 miles. And then the contaminated plume could be out to 35 miles, give or take. If you can avoid this distance from ground zero, that's the ideal situation. Matter of fact, you want to be 50 or 100 or more miles away from ground zero. Now, there will be a certain background radiation from the blast that can potentially go from one continent to another. But what this would primarily do is perhaps raise statistically the levels of cancer and similar type diseases. It's that 25 to 35 miles that could kill you. Both of the books that I've noted, particularly the Nuclear War Survival Skills book, has extensive data on how you can make a permanent and improvised radiation shelter. Now, so I invite you to look at those resources in the books or on the internet for similar instructions. Now, a key thing to keep in mind is 23 inches of dirt or sand or brick or hollow block concrete blocks filled with sand will take the radiation down to 1% of what's on the contaminated side. So if you have 100 rad on the contaminated side, you have 23 inches of dirt or sand, brick, concrete block filled with sand. It'll be 1 rad inside. Or it could be 15 inches of concrete, does the same thing for you. Now, one thing that will help you in this situation of surviving the radioactivity is to have a Geiger counter. Now, once again, this is an example where the books are a bit dated. The Nuclear War Survival Skills book goes into extensive detail on how you can make your own Geiger counter. But it's been 30 years. There are a lot of excellent gear for preppers and people trying to prepare for such things. So a Geiger counter and a dosimeter would be ideal. Matter of fact, I have a separate video on that. I purchased one, the GQ Geiger counter, GMC 500 Plus, for $133.93 off of Amazon. So vastly superior, I submit, to making one yourself. So even if you're 100, 150 miles or more away from a potential ground zero, have a permanent radioactivity shelter, or be able to improvise it quickly by having on hand the proper building materials in sand, sandbags, 4x4s, and that type of thing. Because one of the books notes that if you're 100 miles away from ground zero, the radioactivity, even if it comes that far, it'll take it 3 to 5 hours. So you have a slim window of opportunity to build yourself a fallout shelter. Now, the fourth item is, yes, there is going to be some atmospheric disruption. This could result in temperature lowering for some time, less sunlight in certain growing areas of the combatant countries, also disruptions in supply of modern agricultural means and supplies like fertilizer, and, gasoline and kerosene or diesel engines for common use farm engines. So the agriculture output may greatly decrease, plus transportation systems all messed up. So you need a minimum of 90 days to 3 years worth of food, and also an ability to have clean water. Once again, the Nuclear War Survival Skill book goes into great detail on how to make your own water filter. Why would you do that? You can go down to Walmart, go to the camping section, and get a Sawyer filter for $20 to $30. I submit that's the way to go. I would invite you to look at some preparedness videos that I have in my early part of when I started my channel. There's 12 modules of preparedness, and to review those 12 modules, you need the food and the water access for, like, say, 90 to 3 years, but you also need some to be an all-around prepper, and those 12 modules and videos will show you how to do that. Once again, there is some remarkable progress technology-wise and just outlets for food that's available. One is Emergency Essentials, which is you can find on the internet and is mail order nationwide. There's a really great place called East Coast Food Storage, just east of Charlottesville, Virginia, and Maysville, North Carolina. There's Carolina Readiness. These are, and then another example would be True Prep, which is a store in Marietta, Georgia. All of these you can walk in, You can actually see the food, both commodities and dehydrated food and freeze-dried food. And at East Coast Food Storage, the proprietor of that does an excellent job of teaching you about the food and also letting you sample it. So, 4 major steps to being prepared for a thermonuclear war. 1, don't be under the bomb. Be at minimum 25, 50, 75, 100 or plus miles away. Don't look at the blast light. Look away, close your eyes, cover your face, lay down. Be ready for the radioactivity, potentially. And then the 4th is have proper preparedness, particularly for food and water. So, be prepared.